Mark Delaney had spent 6 weeks planning his 50th birthday party, and it took his wife 90 seconds to turn it into the night his marriage ended in front of everyone he loved. The backyard was strung with warm lights, 40 guests filling the patio with the kind of easy laughter that comes before disaster. Right as Mark lifted his glass to thank everyone for coming, Julia Delaney stepped forward holding a plain white envelope and pressed it into his hands. "Happy birthday," she said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "You've been served." The silence that followed was so complete that Mark could hear the string lights humming overhead. He looked at the envelope. Then he looked at his wife. Then he looked past her to her mother, Barbara Ashford, standing with her arms crossed and a smile that could only be described as triumphant. Barbara began to clap, slow and deliberate, each clap landing like a verdict already decided. What Julia and Barbara did not know, what they could not have possibly imagined, was that Mark Delaney was an estate and trust attorney, a man who had spent 20 years reading the fine print other people signed without looking. And men who read fine print for a living do not get caught off guard twice. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why a mother would applaud the ending of her own daughter's marriage in front of 40 witnesses, you have to understand who Barbara Ashford truly was, and what she had spent nearly 2 decades quietly working toward. This was not the reaction of a woman simply relieved to see her daughter escape an unhappy marriage. There was history here, patient and deliberate, the kind of history that only reveals its full shape when it is far too late to stop. And there is a second question sitting underneath the first one, heavier than it first appears. What had Mark Delaney already done in the 11 weeks before that party, and how had he managed to do it without his own wife noticing a single thing? By the end of this story, the woman clapping in that backyard will be the one left standing completely alone, with no one left to clap for her at all. Mark met Julia at a mutual friend's wedding in Charlotte, North Carolina, 23 years before that birthday party would change everything. He was 29, recently promoted at a regional law firm, careful with money and quick with a joke, the kind of man who noticed when someone's glass was empty before they did. Julia was 27, sharp and funny in a way that made him feel like he had been waiting his whole life for someone to laugh at his jokes properly. They danced twice that night, and he called her 3 days later, something she teased him about for years, insisting he had clearly needed the time to work up his nerve. Within a year they were engaged. Within 2, they were married in a small ceremony that Barbara Ashford, even then, seemed to treat less like her daughter's wedding, and more like an event she was personally overseeing from the front row. From the earliest days of the marriage, Barbara occupied a strange and permanent position just inside the edge of Mark and Julia's life together. She called every morning without fail, sometimes twice, always with a reason that felt urgent to her and small to everyone else. She had opinions about the house they bought, a modest 2-story colonial in a quiet Charlotte neighborhood, calling it charming in a tone that made the word sound like an insult. She had opinions about the car Mark drove, the vacations they took, even the way he loaded the dishwasher, correcting him gently at first, then less gently as the years wore on. Julia laughed it off in those early years, telling Mark her mother simply loved fiercely and had never learned how to step back from anything she cared about. Mark, wanting peace more than he wanted to be right, learned to nod, to absorb the comments, to let Barbara's voice become background noise in his own home, the way a person learns to stop hearing a clock ticking in a room they sit in every day. He told himself this was simply the price of loving a woman whose mother had never learned when to stop. He raised the subject only once, gently, on a quiet evening about 6 years into the marriage, suggesting they might benefit from a little more space as a couple, fewer weeknight dinners with Barbara, more time that belonged only to the 2 of them. Julia's response surprised him with its sharpness. She told him he did not understand what it meant to have a close family, that he was being cold, that his own parents had never been half as involved, and maybe that explained why he struggled to appreciate hers. He let it go, the way he had learned to let most things go, and told himself it was a small price for an otherwise good marriage. By their 15th year together, Mark had built a career that looked, from the outside, like a quiet success story, running his own small estate planning practice that had grown steadily, one referral and one satisfied client at a time. He had a reputation in the local legal community as meticulous, unhurried, and almost old-fashioned in how carefully he read every document before letting a client sign it. Julia worked part-time at a design studio downtown, a job she often credited her mother for encouraging her to pursue, though Mark privately suspected Barbara had pushed the idea mainly so she would have more reasons to visit Julia during the workday. Their 2 children were grown and mostly out of the house by then, one finishing graduate school out of state, the other newly married in Raleigh, which meant that for the first time in decades, it was really just Mark, Julia, and the ever-present presence of Barbara Ashford, who by then spent 3 or 4 evenings a week at their dinner table, uninvited but never once turned away. It was around this time that Mark began noticing something he could not quite name, a change in the texture of ordinary evenings that he could not point to directly, but felt the way a person feels a change in weather before the sky itself has shifted. Conversations between Julia and her mother stopped abruptly the moment he entered a room, replaced by an overly casual comment about dinner plans or the weather. A new financial advisor Julia had started seeing, one recommended by Barbara, whose name Mark did not recognize, and whose office Julia was strangely vague about whenever he asked which firm it was. He told himself he was imagining things, that 20 years of marriage simply made a person notice small shifts too closely, the way a musician notices a single instrument slightly out of tune long before anyone else in the room does. But the notes kept accumulating, quietly, patiently, the way water finds its way into a foundation long before anyone notices the first crack in the plaster. The moment that finally cracked his certainty came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, 11 weeks before his birthday, when Julia left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she stepped outside to take a call from her mother that she said would only take a minute. Mark was not a suspicious man by nature. He had never once in 22 years gone looking through his wife's phone, her purse, or her private messages, believing that trust meant not needing to check. But something on the screen caught his eye before he even meant to look. A subject line in an email thread between Julia and an attorney whose name he had never once heard mentioned in his own home, in a tone far more formal than anything he would have expected between 2 casual acquaintances. He stood there in the quiet kitchen, the refrigerator humming behind him, deciding whether to close the laptop and pretend he had seen nothing at all, or to finally ask the question he had spent years quietly avoiding. Mark chose neither option that night. Instead, he did something far more careful, something closer to the instincts he had spent 2 decades sharpening in his own practice. He memorized the attorney's name, closed the laptop exactly as he had found it, angled precisely the way it had been before, and said nothing to Julia when she came back inside a few minutes later, cheeks slightly flushed from the cold evening air. He told himself he needed proof before raising a single word about it, because voicing suspicion without evidence in a house already run through Barbara's opinions would only hand her another reason to paint him as paranoid, controlling, or unstable, a narrative he suspected she would enjoy constructing. So for the first time in his marriage, Mark Delaney began quietly building a file of his own, starting with a single search of the attorney's name, and the discovery, within minutes, that her small but well-regarded practice specialized almost exclusively in high-asset divorce proceedings. Over the following weeks, Mark moved carefully, the way he had been trained to move through complicated estate disputes for 2 decades, gathering facts patiently before allowing himself to draw a single conclusion. He noticed new deposits and withdrawals moving through a joint account Julia rarely touched, small amounts at first, nothing dramatic, but steady and unexplained. He noticed a storage unit rental appearing on a credit card statement, one neither of them had ever discussed needing, tucked between a grocery charge and a pharmacy visit where it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not already looking closely. He noticed Barbara's visits growing longer and quieter, conversations trailing off into hallways whenever he approached, replaced by sudden discussions of grandchildren, or whether the moment he entered the kitchen. Each detail on its own meant very little. Together, they began forming the outline of something being planned behind his back, something larger and more deliberate than a marriage simply reaching a quiet, mutual end. 3 weeks before his birthday, Mark made the decision that would define everything that followed. He called Renee Castillo, an attorney he had known professionally for over a decade and trusted more than almost anyone outside his own family, someone whose judgment he had relied on through several difficult professional matters over the years, and asked her, quietly, over coffee on a Saturday morning, to review everything he had found. Renee listened without interrupting, flipping slowly through the printed pages Mark had assembled, then told him plainly, in the measured voice she used for clients who needed honesty more than comfort, that what he was describing looked less like a marriage falling apart on its own and more like a marriage being carefully dismantled, piece by piece, with someone else's guidance behind it. She agreed to help him understand exactly what he was facing, and more importantly, to make certain that whatever came next, Mark would not be walking into it blind the way Julia and Barbara clearly assumed he would. Together, over the following weeks, Mark and Renee began quietly documenting the family's shared financial history, the assets Mark had brought into the marriage decades earlier, the modest inheritance his own father had left him years before, and the protections that had, or had not, ever been properly reviewed and updated as the marriage grew more complicated. Renee discovered something Mark himself had genuinely forgotten in the passage of so many years, an old provision from an early estate document drafted not long after his father's passing, a provision that had never been formally altered even as Barbara's influence over household decisions expanded year after year. It was not proof of wrongdoing, but it was a foundation, a quiet place from which Mark could finally begin protecting what was rightfully his before anyone attempted to take it from him. The birthday party arrived on a warm evening in late spring, the backyard strung with lights Mark had helped hang himself 2 days earlier, entirely unaware that his own celebration was already being quietly planned as something else entirely by the 2 women closest to him. 40 guests filled the patio that evening, neighbors, old friends, coworkers from decades spent in the same community, all gathered to celebrate a milestone birthday Mark had genuinely been looking forward to for weeks. He noticed Julia seemed distracted throughout the evening, checking her phone more often than usual, and Barbara oddly cheerful in a way that felt slightly too deliberate, too rehearsed for an ordinary family gathering. He noticed Tom Ashford, Julia's father, avoiding his eyes near the drink table for most of the night, a small detail Mark filed away without yet understanding its full meaning. When Julia stepped forward with the envelope in front of the entire gathering, Mark felt the air leave his lungs even though, somewhere underneath the shock, a colder and steadier part of him had already suspected a moment like this was coming. He opened the envelope slowly, aware of every eye on him, aware of Barbara's arms crossing behind her daughter's shoulder in practiced satisfaction. When Barbara began to clap, Mark did not flinch, did not raise his voice, did not give the room the reaction it seemed to be waiting for from him. He simply folded the papers closed, looked at his wife for a long, quiet moment, and said only that he understood. Then he reached into his own jacket pocket, where an envelope of his own had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment to arrive. In the days following the party, word spread quickly through the small, tightly connected circle of friends and neighbors who had witnessed the scene unfold. Mark became, almost overnight, the subject of quiet pity and quieter judgment, a man whose wife had apparently reached her limit after years of a marriage no one outside the family had ever truly understood from the inside. Julia and Barbara, for their part, seemed to settle into a kind of practiced comfort in the weeks that followed, accepting condolences and knowing looks from people who assumed Mark had somehow driven his own wife to such a public and humiliating decision. Barbara, in particular, made no real effort to hide her satisfaction, telling more than one mutual friend at church or over lunch that some things were simply long overdue. Mark, meanwhile, allowed the narrative to stand exactly as it was, offering no correction, no defense, no explanation to anyone who assumed the worst of him. He did not correct old friends at the coffee shop who offered him sympathetic, careful smiles, or the neighbor at the hardware store who gave him an awkward, knowing nod one Saturday morning. He let himself appear exactly as broken and blindsided as everyone assumed him to be, because he understood something Julia and Barbara had not yet considered in their confidence, that being underestimated was, for the moment, the single most valuable position he could occupy. Every appearance of weakness bought him time, and time was the one thing he needed most to finish what he and Renee had quietly started weeks before any of this became public. It was during this period that Diane Kowalski, a longtime colleague from Mark's professional circle who had also become something close to family over the years, reached out to him under the simple guise of checking in on an old friend going through a difficult time. Mark had always trusted Diane without question, had recommended her for professional opportunities early in her career, had considered her nearly as close as family for well over a decade. But something in the careful, overly casual way she asked about his plans, his finances, and what he intended to do next left him with a familiar, uneasy feeling he could not immediately place. He said little in response, offering only vague and discouraged answers designed to reveal nothing, and later that evening mentioned the conversation to Renee, who suggested, gently but firmly, that Mark consider the uncomfortable possibility that not everyone close to him was entirely on his side in this. Renee's instincts proved sharper than either of them expected. Within days, Mark discovered, through a records request tied to his own estate planning documents, that Diane had been quietly in contact with Barbara for months, sharing small, seemingly harmless details about Mark's financial situation that Barbara had then used to help guide Julia's legal strategy from behind the scenes. It was not a dramatic betrayal, not the kind that made headlines or dinner party gossip, but a slow, practical one, the kind built patiently from years of trust being carefully, quietly exploited by someone who likely believed she would never be discovered at all. Mark did not confront Diane directly. Instead, he simply stopped sharing anything meaningful with her, and let her continue believing she still had full access to his life and his plans. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings moved forward exactly as Barbara and Julia seemed to expect them to, with aggressive demands, an accelerated timeline, and a clear underlying assumption that Mark, humiliated and emotionally exhausted from the public spectacle, would simply agree to whatever terms were placed in front of him just to make the embarrassment end sooner. For several weeks, it genuinely appeared their assumption might prove correct. Mark's public silence, his quiet withdrawal from social gatherings, and his refusal to publicly defend himself all seemed to confirm exactly the version of events Julia and Barbara had carefully constructed for their friends and family. What none of them understood was that Mark's silence was never surrender at all. It was preparation, careful and deliberate, for a courtroom neither of them yet realized was already waiting on the horizon. Renee, working quietly alongside Mark through those difficult weeks, built a case grounded not in anger, but in documentation, financial records establishing the true timeline of Julia and Barbara's planning, correspondence confirming how long the divorce had actually been arranged behind closed doors, and clear evidence of the original estate protections Mark had established decades earlier, protections that had, in fact, never lapsed the way Barbara's own advisor had mistakenly assumed they had. Piece by piece, over the course of that long, difficult summer, the picture Barbara believed she had already won began to look considerably more fragile than either she or her daughter had ever imagined it could become. The first hearing before Judge Elena Pratt was scheduled 6 weeks after the party, and Julia's legal team arrived that morning with visible confidence, expecting a relatively straightforward proceeding given how thoroughly they believed they had already outmaneuvered Mark, both emotionally and financially. What they had not accounted for was Renee Castillo standing calmly beside Mark with a case built not on emotion or spectacle, but on 11 careful weeks of quiet, methodical preparation. When Renee began presenting the timeline to the court, showing precisely when Julia's outside legal consultations had begun, and how closely they aligned with Barbara's own financial maneuvering months earlier, the confidence on the other side of the room visibly began to falter for the first time. The revelation that reshaped the entire proceeding came when Renee introduced the original estate documentation Mark had established decades earlier, protections surrounding the inheritance from his own father that had never actually been altered, despite Barbara's advisor apparently assuming otherwise when constructing their financial strategy. The assets Julia and her attorney had been counting on as part of an equitable division were, under North Carolina law, never truly available to divide in the way they had planned around for months. Judge Pratt reviewed the documentation with visible care, asked several pointed questions directly to Julia's counsel, and made clear from the bench that the aggressive financial demands filed weeks earlier rested on assumptions that simply did not hold up under proper scrutiny. Julia's expression in that courtroom shifted slowly from certainty to something closer to disbelief, as the reality of the situation became clear to her for what seemed like the very first time. She had trusted her mother's confidence completely throughout this entire process, had believed the plan Barbara assured her was airtight from the beginning, and was only now beginning to understand how much of that confidence had been built on assumption rather than solid fact. Mark, watching quietly from across the room, felt no real satisfaction in her visible confusion, only a tired, quiet clarity that the version of his marriage he had spent 22 years believing in had, in many important ways, never fully existed the way he once thought it had. The deeper revelation, the one that would ultimately recontextualize the entire birthday party itself, came from records Renee had carefully obtained showing communications between Barbara and Diane Kowalski stretching back nearly a full year, long before Mark had ever noticed the first small cracks appearing in his marriage. The plan, it slowly became clear to everyone in that courtroom, had not originated with Julia's unhappiness at all. It had originated with Barbara, who had spent years quietly resenting the modest, steady life Mark had built for her daughter, and who had systematically guided Julia toward a decision she herself might never have arrived at entirely on her own. Judge Pratt, reviewing the full scope of the evidence presented over the following sessions, made clear that, while the ending of the marriage itself remained a private matter between the two individuals involved, the deliberate attempt to manipulate financial disclosures and strip away protected assets through carefully calculated timing would not be looked upon favorably by the court. The proceedings shifted decisively in the weeks that followed, with the aggressive terms Julia's team had initially demanded slowly collapsing under the weight of documentation Mark and Renee had quietly assembled since that ordinary Tuesday evening in the kitchen, 11 weeks before anyone had ever clapped at all. In the months that followed, the full shape of Barbara Ashford's involvement became impossible for Julia to continue ignoring, no matter how she tried to reconcile it with the mother she believed she had always known. What had once looked like a mother fiercely protecting her daughter's future revealed itself, piece by piece, as something closer to a woman quietly using her own daughter to settle a resentment that had never truly been about Mark at all. Barbara had spent decades feeling as though her own life had turned out smaller than she believed she deserved, and somewhere along the way, Julia's marriage had slowly become the place where that old, buried resentment finally found its outlet. Julia, sitting across from Mark during one of the final mediation sessions that autumn, admitted quietly that she no longer fully recognized the plan she had once believed, with such certainty, was entirely her own. Diane Kowalski's quiet involvement eventually came to light as well, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the same careful documentation that had steadily unraveled everything else over those difficult months. She did not lose a courtroom battle of her own, but she lost something perhaps more lasting in the end, the trust of a professional community that had once respected her steady reputation, and a friendship with Mark that had spanned nearly 15 years of genuine, if ultimately misplaced, closeness. She never offered an explanation Mark found remotely satisfying, only a brief, uncomfortable apology delivered months later over the phone, one he accepted politely, and never fully believed was entirely honest. Mark walked away from the marriage with the protections he and Renee had carefully preserved fully intact, not out of any real desire for vengeance, but simply because he had refused to allow a plan built so deliberately on deception to succeed unchallenged against him. He did not gloat in the aftermath, did not seek any public vindication among the friends and neighbors who had once pitied him, and largely let the same quiet circle that had once judged him slowly come to understand, entirely on their own timeline, a fuller and more complicated version of what had actually happened that spring. Some relationships from that circle repaired themselves naturally over time, as people quietly reconsidered what they thought they had witnessed. Others, particularly his connection to Barbara, ended permanently and without any real ceremony at all. Barbara Ashford, in the end, found herself increasingly isolated from the very family she had once genuinely believed she was protecting through every phone call and every quiet piece of advice. Julia, working slowly through the uncomfortable process of separating her own choices from her mother's lifelong influence, distanced herself from Barbara in ways that surprised almost everyone who had known the two of them as inseparable for so many years. The woman who had clapped so confidently in that backyard, so certain of her own victory in that single triumphant moment, eventually found there was no longer anyone left standing beside her willing to clap for anything at all. What this story ultimately reveals is not simply a cautionary tale about betrayal between a husband and wife, but a quieter, and perhaps more uncomfortable truth about the cost of allowing someone else's lifelong resentment to guide the most important decisions of your own life. Julia's undoing, in the end, was never really about Mark at all. It was about a lifetime spent deferring to her mother's judgment over her own instincts, until the two had become almost impossible for her to separate when it finally mattered most. Was justice truly served in this story, or did everyone involved simply lose something none of them can ever fully get back again? Would you have noticed the same quiet warning signs Mark spent years quietly overlooking in his own home, if you were in Mark's position, sitting in that kitchen looking at a laptop screen you were never meant to see? What would you have done differently in his place? Let us know in the comments below. We genuinely read every single one of them. And if this story affected you the way it has affected so many others who have shared their own experiences with us, wait until you hear what happens in our next story, where a quiet inheritance dispute uncovers something no one in the family ever expected to find. Subscribe now so you never miss the next real-life story of trust, betrayal, and quiet vindication.